All right. Welcome to my presentation. Thank you for joining me. My name is Paul Linden. I am Associate Professor of Media and Entertainment Arts at the University of Southern Mississippi. Really excited to have the opportunity to share some of my research here. This is a sort of development of mid-century R&B into rock and roll type of story, but instead of coming at it the way that it has been treated in the many articles and books on the topic, from history of popular culture, musicology, cultural studies, identity politics, philosophy, even texts coming at it from a religious point of view. I'm trying to return to this well-known story with the presupposition that added historical understanding will benefit from interdisciplinary perspective. And so I am, shooting for the aim of the paper is really to enrich the understanding of this story through the lens of how radio technology interacts with geophysical phenomenon to create the possibility for very long-range broadcasts. And then once we have an idea of how that could work, then looking at the impact of those broadcasts on some of the sociocultural norms and business practices in place, to look at the disruption, at the creation of new horizons of possibility, and some of those kind of broader questions. Okay, let me get my slides going here. There we go. So my research questions are very broad. What innovations existed in radio technology and broadcast management in the mid-20th century, and then how did the impact of these forces of innovation create benefits for the mainstreaming of marginalized forms of popular music, and in particular blues music, and the fact that it is understood today as being a seminal form of music, giving sort of birth to other entire genres and other styles of music, is very much to the point, as I hope to show here. The basic kind of storytelling apparatus I'm going to use, is by resorting to two sort of discursive registers, I guess you could say. So on the scientific inquiry side, looking at how AM technology differs from FM technology, and then some of the interactions at the upper levels of the atmosphere that permit this skywave effect. And then on the sociocultural inquiry side, looking at existing narratives surrounding the birth of rock and roll, the issue of race and the content of those broadcasts, the partitioning of the ownership of the recorded music industry during the 1950s, are also part of that sort of dual storytelling. And so I'm looking to superpose, like I said, those two registers. Okay, so we'll start with a brief, abridged timeline of radio technology, moving from the experimental phase of the late 1800s to a sort of industrial phase. And by about 1912, the technology was to that point. However, because of the delay of World War I, you have to wait till 1920 with KDKA as the first station out of Pittsburgh. And this is all AM, right? So the original sort of way that radio worked was amplitude modulated. We won't get into the details of that. If you want more info here, I've got the sort of the larger publication out of the most recent edition of the MIA Journal. And so the fact of the skywave effect that we're going to get into here, is part and parcel of why FM technology was seen as being the preferred and became the sort of primary broadcast bandwidth by the approximately early 70s. So, that innovation is the product of a Columbia professor, Edwin Armstrong, who's here in the middle. And so he worked for 15 or 20 years inventing this technology. And then by the time of, the 1960s, FM technology, the growth of it, and the fact that it was sort of the way the way forward, is, I think, signified by the fact that the FCC prohibited broadcast companies from simulcasting on both of these. And so this kind of ushered in and marks in time the period during which FM starts to become the predominant form. So what we're looking at here is sort of, the part of the time frame that I want to isolate is basically the late 30s, 30s and 40s through the mid 60s, as the sort of last era of the predominance of AM radio. So keep that in mind. And now let's look at what in the world am I talking about with the Skywave effect. Okay, so simplified, it's basically what happens to some radio waves at upper levels of the atmosphere. So the atmosphere is composed of several 8 or 9 layers. Consult your science book for that, but the ionosphere, being the exterior one that I want to look at, really works to filter. It's a place where the filtration of the sun's UV radiation also interacts with potentially radio waves that are propagating outward from the Earth's surface. Now, what I'm showing here and the way that the Skywave effect works is really a dynamic sort of a model, because as the solar wind is pushing in the image from the left with the arrows, it pushes on the ionosphere and it brings it closer, or all of the ionosphere in particular, closer to the Earth's surface during the day. It expands it because it's supercharged with the ionization and the filtration of the UV radiation. And then on the back side, you can see the tail extending outward, of the ionosphere. And so that's one of the main variables, is the diurnal versus the nocturnal sort of mode, I guess, of what's going on in terms of this positioning of the ionosphere and then how it impacts radio broadcasts. And now we have a little broadcast tower here that's way out of scale, and then 2 sorts of radio waves here, AM and FM. So that's the second variable here. It would be the radio wave spectrum. So the radio waves consist of waves from the ultra low frequency to just beneath microwaves on the electromagnetic spectrum. And so in terms of like wavelength, if you want to visualize like how long are these waves, ultra low frequencies being in the thousands of feet, so like the size of a mountain, and then the ones closer to the microwaves would be about the size of a bottle of pop, so about 6 inches or so. And so as frequency increases, wavelengths get small enough so that wavelengths decreases and they get small enough to sort of go through the sort of ionized shield of the Earth's upper atmosphere. And so that's where you start to get an understanding of the difference between AM and FM technology here, because they interact with the ionosphere in 2 separate ways. Essentially, during the day, there's like this Goldilocks range that science recognized between 3 megahertz and 30 megahertz. Anything smaller than a wavelength smaller than 30 megahertz, so higher frequency than that, was going to go off into space. And then anything below 3 megacycles would lose too much energy and kind of get lost in the lower atmosphere. But right between those two, they started to notice that this kind of bending. And so that is the Skywave effect, is when you've got a transmission signal that interacts with the ionosphere and then parabolically sort of is refracted back to Earth. When you apply this to the AM, FM situation, the FM signals are going to be, like 100 megahertz on the 100 on the FM dials, about a 10-foot long wave. That's going to escape into space. 1,000 kilohertz on the AM dial, that's 1,000 feet long. And so that's long enough to potentially get reflected back to Earth. but it depends on day versus night. So we're going to look at that a little bit more closely as the second sort of variable. So as you can see, the daylight side is going to push it closer to the Earth, which is going to reduce that distance right there. But it also thickens this lineup quite a bit because it's supercharged, and it results with a very poor quality broadcast on the reflected side. So in this kind of, you can imagine the kind of home territory of the broadcast area is normal quality, but when you're way out here during the daytime, the quality tends to be staticky, and it's just not very interesting. And so, big deal for the Skywave Effect? Perhaps not. But now let's turn it to the nighttime. So the daytime Skywave Effect, for United States power, 50,000 watts or less radio stations, is about 200 to 300 miles, but the broadcast quality does suffer, as we mentioned. On the nighttime side, however, the diagram shows, the ranges kind of balloon up to like 1,000 miles or more, depending on the frequencies. And the Goldilocks frequency of 3 megahertz drops down considerably because of the fact that the quality here of the ionosphere is no longer disturbed by constantly dealing with solar wind coming in, and so it consolidates and gets much more sort of mirror-like and perfect in terms of its ability to reflect. So the quality of the broadcast that returns back to Earth at these great distances is actually quite good at nighttime. And so that's what's really an important thing to notice here about the Skywave Effect, is that it is a nighttime phenomenon for AM radio stations to kind of broadcast over long distance. And so that's really going to be the answer to our first question is, what are the innovations in radio broadcast technology in the middle of the 1900s, middle of the 20th century? And so that's going to be a pretty big one. So the FCC was, of course, quick to recognize this. You've got a burgeoning new industry. They adopt the U.S. Senate's Wheeler resolution that imposes a 50,000 watt ceiling on how powerful a station can be. And so this was 1938, by the way. So the industry is essentially not even 2 decades old. And that also included in that resolution was this sort of tiered designation, hierarchy of different stations, which ones were allowed to be max power, and those are called clear channel stations. They could transmit at 50,000 watts and 24 hours a day. And then the regional stations may have to reduce power at nighttime in order to reduce this conflict of the Skywave Effect. And then the local, smallest wattage stations would power down at nighttime. And so that's kind of looking at, how the law or administration, government is reacting to the impact of the Skywave Effect here. So, a pertinent example of that might be like KMVP out of Chicago, for example. So this is AM 1000 still operating, and they basically, have that frequency for their area, right, during the daytime. But at nighttime, you have other stations that are 1000 AM in the area, or in, the sort of eastern side of the United States, that have to either shut down or reduce power because KVMP really does rule the roost from sunset to sunrise with a broadcast area of about 3.1 million square miles, believe it or not. So that's pretty impressive, but it's nothing compared to the X. Those of you who are fans of ZZ Top know about, I heard it on the X, so that's referring to XERF AM 1570 out of Acuña, Mexico. And they were referred to as an outlaw flamethrower. So they have a 250,000 watt transmitter, which during the evening hours at full power reaches from Tel Aviv all the way to the east, all the way to Australia. So an intense amount of power set up, as you can see in this diagram here. So these are some photos of like the massive transmitter electron tubes in there that are responsible for generating this amount of power. But you can see that the transmitter tower is here just over the border from Texas. It's actually 1.4 or 1.7 miles, 1.5 miles from the Texas border. This is clear channel, 1570 AM, 250,000 watts. And, so this is a good, answer to our first question of, what does broadcast of the technology look like? Now you've got the frequency 1570 AM basically being wiped out for large swath of the entire planet Earth because of this power mixed with the technology, or mixed with, I guess, the scientific phenomenon, which is allowing for incredibly long-range broadcast to take place. Okay, so let's now sort of import a little bit from the the popular culture side, look at the record business, the radio business as well. So what's happening on the recorded side of things, during this time frame, which is roughly from the Wheeler Resolution, so 1938, around to 1940 up to about 1970, when FM is established as the predominant platform and the kind of AM era is at a close. So, the first interesting parable or story that I picked up from Jeffrey Hull's The Recording Industry book, a fantastic story about the problem of rock and roll, which was he tells the story that in the year 1950, the recorded music market looked as it should. You had the majors in control of 75%. You got the indies in control of 25%, and the world is the sun is shining as it should. But by the end of 1959, he takes the snapshot, and it's exactly the inverse, right? So the majors apparently have passed on rock and roll as a novelty that they don't expect to have the staying power of Sinatra, for example, and as a result, they've lost market share, right? And so you've got these various techniques to sort of correct the ship, like the cover song, for example. So using major label artists signed to major labels to re-record songs that were had been popularized on these. And so here's your representative selection of independent labels, chess and specialty. So songs recorded there were doing quite well, but by re-recording them, cover versions, and putting the muscle of the major labels behind them, and also a white face, the sales were multiples of what the indies were able to do. On the radio, so that's kind of a story that's taking place during this. On the radio side, you've got shifts in the management of radio stations with some early DJs. By early, I mean late 40s, like Hunter Hancock in particular, out of Los Angeles, Alan Freed out of Cleveland, who are locating obscure, unknown, I guess, to the mainstream. So relatively obscure recordings. So on these specialty, independent labels, and broadcasting. So having shows based on this, sort of turning people on. But this, Hunter Hancock in particular was he was a white DJ, but he was playing black music for a largely black audience. And this was in the afternoon. Had an afternoon show, small 5,000 watt station. So wasn't really it's notable from a historical point of view. But then you have others that are coming along doing the exact same thing. And I'm not here to say who went first, because that's the big kind of DJ thing about who was the first one to do this. But Alan Freed, and then the gang out of WLAC in Nashville, so Nobles, Richburg, Hossman, and Grizzard, we're all picking up on this, but as time went on, you move from this early phase of kind of playing obscure, recordings of, jump blues or upbeat R&B music to the second phase where the station programmers are embracing the Skywave Effect. And so the motto for WLAC in Nashville was that we're the nighttime station for half the nation. And this carried through. And then, of course, when you've got in 1960, so this is after, we're well into the mainstreaming of rock and roll here, Elvis signing with RCA, I think that was 57. And so leaving Sun Records as the independent and going to the major label, and then working on his image and sort of correcting the problem of rock and roll, putting a crown on his head, made the pill go down a little bit earlier, but easier because there was no putting the genie back in the bottle after you've got these broadcasts and this music is going out everywhere. So to get back to XERF, that's 1960 that was built approximately. And so Wolfman Jack was the Robert Smith, his biographical name. So he's the DJ that's associated with that. And so that's a little bit of the, what's going on the record label side, what's going on the radio management side is also very interesting. And then when you look at the cultural impacts, like how this stuff is landing, that's what's really the most interesting to me. So here's a quote from Greg Allman, grew up in Jacksonville, Florida, so 600 miles from Nashville. And he's talking about growing up and staying up late to listen to WLAC. In this interview, he says, that's how I got turned on to Muddy Waters, Howlin' Wolf, and B.B. King. Pretty major considering, the Allman Brothers, the debt of that band to blues music. Of course, they melded it with jazz and then kind of added their own twist. But by the same token, here's Billy Gibbons from ZZ Top singing I Heard It on the X. So he pens this lyric, and he grew up in Houston, which 800 miles from Nashville. And, he says, that's where I learned my licks. I'm talking about that Outlaw X, XERF he's referring to. And here's a third one. There are a lot of these, but these are some of my favorite ones. So now we've got not just artists that were going to be mainstream, rock and rollers that were talking about how they were accessing music as a result, of this kind of scientific phenomenon. They're getting these transmissions from a long way away. Now you've got an entire genre of music. So Paul Coppola's article From Memphis to Kingston, and Kingston to Nashville, by the way, 1,400 miles. And he's talking about how ska is derivative from these transmissions that were from, blues music, rhythm and blues music that were played on these stations. And he says, and this is Winston Maritone Blake, who was basically like a sound operator for some of the parties. But Winston says, growing up in Kingston, we could hear those stations just like we pick up the local station and they're 1,400 miles away. So obviously something's going on there, and it is the Skywave Effect, of course. So interesting story. So just want to wrap up a little bit of the discussion here with, what is science doing, right, to established norms? The content of the broadcasts themselves, they are kind of turning common laborers, the singers, descendants of slaves or sharecroppers, elevating the lowest levels of society into global diplomats. The content of the songs themselves, once again, really doing things to America's Bible Belt that really probably shouldn't be done. So abhorrent to polite society. You can see Grandma at the Thanksgiving table while Wynonna Harris is piped over the radio speaker, singing, what's his lyric? Keep on pumping till the butter comes. Wipe off the paddle and churn some more. That's going to be an eyebrow raiser in that situation. So, you also have the short circuiting of established label practices. It was very common for independent labels to enter into contractual agreements with majors to get their distribution network, opened up to these smaller labels. But in this case, you've got a young hip DJ in the mid 50s was able to create similar scales of visibility with a single nighttime play. There's the messaging part. That's good. And then the question of the transistor radio, very interesting, to cultivate an individualized relationship through the radio that was much different from what we see in the 1930s and 1940s, where you've got the radio console as the centerpiece of the home or the living space perhaps, and family gathers around to listen to the news or some music show, or Orson Welles talking about Martians invading. With the transistor radio, however, there's a lot more ownership of youth to apply music to create sort of the soundtrack or the backdrop of whatever the experience they're getting into. So a beach party or a drive-in, or the mall shop and physical graffiti, or the list goes on. Even kind of furtively listening after everybody's gone to bed, listening under the covers with your personal radio. There's a direct form of communication going on there that is probably not what is intended by some of the segregationist efforts. You call that hegemonic, status quo, if you will, but the effort to kind of maintain a separation between a class separation, if you will. So the Skywave Effect, I guess, when it comes to the question of mainstreaming R&B into rock and roll, it can definitely be seen as letting the genie out of the bottle, and in that sense, kind of undoing the work of segregation and forcing the social, the issues of social and racial confrontation over and against what was going on at the major labels by like the sort of what ended up as a whitewashing effect, essentially, of the cover strategy and the resulting marginalization of original artists. So there's that, but at the same time, and so that's like a liberating gesture, but at the same time, it's empowering the potency of later mainstream rock and roll as it reaches talented musicians like Greg Allman and Billy Gibbons, who would then become inspired and active creators in their own right. So it's sort of indifferent to that. It's the science is what it is, but it's up to man and people to kind of make meaning out of that and to turn it into something salient. And so I hope you've enjoyed this presentation, and I look forward to answering questions.